Welcome to the Master My Balance podcast. Join your host, Melissa Boyle, as she explores aspects of life that influence your financial well-being and personal growth.
And welcome to today's episode of Master My Balance. And today I'm delighted to have with me Dr. Sarah Sheridan. And Sarah is joining us today to discuss a recent report that was published. It was Focus Ireland. It was published. You undertook the research and it was published by Focus Ireland. So It's a really insightful report. And the report is Lone Parents and Homelessness in Ireland. So Sarah, before we kick off, if you want to introduce yourself and basically what your background is.
Yeah. So thanks, Melissa, for inviting me onto the podcast. My name is Sarah Sheridan and I'm an independent researcher. I do service evaluations and different research reports, but primarily in the area of housing and homelessness. And my background in research is in this space. I did a PhD on women's homelessness in Ireland, and then I worked in research management positions in Focus Ireland and the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commissions. Also do some lecturing in Trinity College in the topic of homelessness too.
And what was your initial draw to this research? Was it your prior experience with your PhD work?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of overlaps actually in terms of, female homelessness and lone parents, of course. This particular study was funded by Focus Ireland and they had received it's part of a wider European research initiative that is across 8 different countries, and there's academics, there's trade unions, and there's NGOs participating in this. It's called Involve, and you can check it out online as well, just what's happening in different countries. But Focus Ireland are leading the Irish contribution, and they chose to focus on the experience of lone parents, of course, due to the high rates of homelessness among lone parents, or within the family homeless figures, the predominance of lone parent families. And so this particular group that I had interviewed for this research would be at the most extreme end of housing and housing precarity and homelessness. So it was really to look at their lives and their experiences in this space. But yeah, there's definitely lots of overlaps with my previous research.
When I was looking at the report, lone parents families make up about 17% of all family households in Ireland. So it is a huge amount that you were looking at.
17% of all family households, this was a census figure actually, of all family households are headed by lone parents. And in fact, 25% of all households with children are headed by lone parents. So yeah, substantial numbers in the country. And in terms of homeless family figures, it fluctuates a small bit, but consistently the majority of homeless families are headed by lone parents. It's usually around 65%. So they're always disproportionately represented in those figures.
You know, there was so much that came through in the report, but there was one thing that I thought would be good to point out. The methodology for the figures and the statistics in this report, it's different than the usual figures for homelessness. Can you explain to our listeners how, the numbers were counted?
So there's 2 things there. I think one is, you're talking about the who's counted in the homeless figures. Yeah. So in that regard, the figures that are published on a monthly basis in Ireland are referring to the number of men, women and children in homeless emergency accommodation that are funded under Section 10 of the Housing Act. And this includes all people who are in Section 10 funded emergency accommodation. So what this doesn't include is those who are in domestic violence refuges, for example, those who are in direct provision, and those, for example, who are in direct provision who have a right to remain but can't exit this space because there's no housing available. And it also doesn't include hidden homelessness. So those who are sofa surfing, living in overcrowded, inadequate accommodation. So there's other countries in Europe that do include this, like in Denmark and in Finland, for example, and elsewhere. But in Ireland, it is specifically those who are in emergency accommodation. In terms of the methodology for this study, there was 19 lone parents who were recruited into the study, and they were interviewed on 2 separate occasions by me. So the first interview, I met with them. We discussed their personal situation at the moment, how they were recruited mostly through homeless services and lone parent support groups. So either they were homeless or they were in very precarious housing, or they had previously been homeless. So different kind of we had a wider, I suppose, definition of homelessness than might be included in the monthly figures. The first interview looking at their personal circumstances, how they became homeless, their money situation, their family situation, their education and their employment, and their education employment history. And then the second interview, I was really looking at their interactions with services. So what helped them, what was more challenging, what services weren't there, what they needed, and just in general, their interactions with and their experiences within the wider service system. So, yeah.
Okay. And from the research that you've done, what was the everyday financial life like for those people that took part in your interviews?
So what I would say is those who I interviewed, financial inadequacy was the biggest problem that they were experiencing in their lives. And this predates their homelessness. And of course, it had a part to play in their becoming homeless, but also those who had exited homelessness and were in maybe a more stable situation, their economic difficulties continue. So it was very much a huge stressor in their life, and it interacted with and exacerbated their housing problems. But, it continued pre and post homelessness. And this actually reflects wider, statistics that are and research analysis that's out there. So if you look at the full report, by the way, is available on the Focus Ireland website, and it has a really detailed literature review and policy review of all different aspects of the lives of lone parents. But there's a lot of work being done by, for example, the ESRI on, wider studies on housing and poverty and, employment, and even their longitudinal study on children and young people. But they would very often, focus on the experience of lone parents as a subgroup as well. And they consistently find that lone parents are impacted by poverty and deprivation. And across all their, the Silk data, across all these data sets, they would consistently score very highly across poverty and deprivation. So, my small sample of 19 people, while I went into a lot more depth than the wider statistical studies, is really reflected, quantitative statistical analysis of lone parents. So it's massive. That's your question. Yeah.
And do you think, did the participants, do you think that they felt that like wider society in general understands the situation that they're in?
It's a really interesting question, and it's not something I asked them specifically, but certainly there was a sense from the parents that I interviewed that they felt quite isolated. And this does, I suppose, go hand in hand with being, with experiencing poverty and the excessive care burden on them by virtue of being a lone parent, and especially, lone parents who are in homeless situations may have like ruptured support social networks. They may not be near family or friends or, local communities. And very often they feel like they don't know where to turn. They're in this crisis and they really don't know where to turn. And in this sense, I think many of them did feel quite forgotten, by wider society. I think, the nature of being in emergency accommodation, you're not allowed to have visitors, or there's just general rules and restrictions on your life. And and again, as I said, you're far from natural, your natural support network. So yeah, I think there was a sense of that among the parents I interviewed.
And I noticed the term poverty trap came up a lot throughout the report. How did that look like for those lone parents that you were interviewing?
So what came through, and this was really widely reported across the sample. So all of the parents that I'd interviewed were receiving social welfare benefit of some kind at this time. Many of them had fairly, strong employment histories or had been in the workforce for some time, but since becoming a lone parent, very often their employment pathways were quite disrupted. So they were, and among those who were on social welfare, some of them were blending this with part-time employment as well to kind of supplement their income and to also, be there to care for their children too. But there was a real fear of, exceeding the income threshold that's, in place for one parent family payments. And they were also very fearful of losing their, ancillary benefits like medical card, for example, in the future. And these are really important, particularly for parents who have maybe health problems themselves, but also if their children have additional support needs. And also a lot of these parents would have been in work that was maybe their hours could flux and change from week to week, and then this could, cause big complications and bureaucratic challenges for them in managing their social welfare payment at the same time. So this has to be really carefully managed by lone parents. It can be really, really stressful. And in this way, they felt that they were being trapped in a situation of poverty, so it was serving as a disincentive. And I think there was and we can discuss this later in the discussion, but there's an assumption that parents are trying to and this was reflected in other research by Mary Murphy in the University of Maynooth, but there's an assumption that they're kind of want to nest in their in-work benefits or their nest or game the system and that type of thing. It really wasn't the case. They really they wanted to work, but they wanted quality work, and they wanted work that was able to be flexible with the demands that they had, so as to create a better future for them and their children. So, I think they did feel stuck. I mean, many of them use that word stuck in their situation, especially for parents of young children.
Yeah. And when it came to their finances, are the participants, would they, from the research, is it their struggle more managing the finances or the lack of financial resources to deal with the bills that they have?
Yeah, I would say the latter. I would say from the interviews I did, it was evident that the lone parents were savvy with their very limited money, because they were managing these exorbitant rents a lot of the time, and or maybe even if they were on HAP, they may have to pay considerable HAP top up, directly to their landlord, which really we don't know a huge amount about what's happening across the board with HAP recipients. Also, really high childcare costs, as you know, and general cost of living pressures, which has really worsened since COVID. So that combined in a way that lone parents were forced to live under these extreme financial pressures. So I would say it was more struggling to have enough income to get by rather than their own particular issues in managing their finances. They were managing very little and very effectively, considering it so little.
And when it comes to the housing and the experience of homelessness, with the participants, was it like an initial shock or a sudden loss of the home they were living in, or was it after a long period of negotiations or difficulties there?
Yeah, I think there was a few different pathways into homelessness. While it can come as a crisis, a shock, it's played out in different ways. So, and this is again reflected in other research elsewhere that was carried out when I was working in Focus Ireland as well. But many times, lone parents are in the private rented market, for example. They receive a notice of termination because their landlord wants to sell predominantly, or maybe take the property back into their own use or move back in. And so they have this valid notice of termination. And so they're panicking. They don't know where to turn. So they're looking everywhere. They cannot find anything, even remotely, in their price range. So there comes to a point where they have to vacate the property, and they're very often will move in with friends and family for a period of time. They might change for different friends or family situations. And this obviously becomes untenable over time, because maybe friends or family have their own housing pressures, or could be overcrowded, or there could be a breakdown of, relationship if they're moving in with family. In general, the situation will fall apart. So then really the last resort for families in this situation is to present to the local authority as homeless. So it could have been a shock originally, or this housing crisis, but usually this manifested itself over time in very precarious, transient, unsuitable situations before they present to their local authority as homeless. Then there's other cases where it might be a domestic violence situation, and that will create a housing crisis, of course, if the lone parent decides to leave their home, or indeed another relationship breakdown. And there was a couple of parents also that I interviewed who were not in tenancies that were recognised under the RTB or the Rental Tenancies Bureau, but rather they might have been in licensee kind of arrangements. They don't have any tenancy rights, or they might have been subletting. So they mightn't have had tenancy rights to begin with. There was quite a number of them that were in that situation before their housing crisis kind of began. But if you step back and look at the wider homeless families in general, the majority are coming their root cause of homelessness is from the private rented sector, with their landlord giving them a valid notice of termination, and they become homeless.
Okay. And I can only imagine when they become homeless, whether they're in homeless accommodation or whether they've moved in with family, try to manage their finances then. Because even distance,
Yeah.
you know, if they move into homeless accommodation, that could be anywhere. They
Yeah.
may have lived in like the outskirts of Dublin and all of a sudden they're moved into Dublin city centre then. So they have the cost of travel,
Yeah.
those bringing the kids to school and everything like that. And
Yeah.
did that come across the difficulty in financial planning, say?
As I said, the financial problems, yeah, it did come before homelessness. There was one interesting thing that happened for some families. So some families may be in emergency. So if you're in a family hub, you have to pay a very small amount to cover your costs. But very often in these more, I mean, they're really not suitable at all for families at all. But some of these private emergency accommodation, they might be like the townhouse or B&B, whatever, in Dublin city centre. Sometimes they can be free of charge. So it can have I would use this word really tentatively, but like a silver lining effect where families actually can start to slowly gather money for a deposit as they're in a homeless situation. But I would say, and they said this themselves, it's not like it was working out for them money wise. It was more reflects the immense pressure they were in the community too.
Yeah.
That they have to go into this extreme crisis to be able to kind of manage this. But absolutely, like I think a lot of the families would be living on, takeaways, convenience food. They don't have access to proper kitchen facilities. This is really expensive, and it does put added pressure on families. In terms of transport, I'm not sure what the situation is now, but I do think that there is some coverage of families for like leap cards and that type of thing that's offered by the local authority. But that doesn't take from the fact that they may have to take 2 buses to get into school or be traveling for a long time to get to they're in the city. They might have to go back out to the suburbs, out in Balbriggan or, quite far away from the city centre. So it is really a logistical nightmare for many families. And there in some ways there are additional pressures. That was something that also came through, but more reflects the wider issue of financial problems for families.
Yeah. And then I think one of the big barriers that showed up in the report as well was that of childcare. So
Yeah.
did that come across to you as one of the major barriers?
Yeah, it was just massive. There's on so many levels to it because, if you're in emergency accommodation and you don't have childcare and you need to, for example, view properties to exit homelessness and you're dragging your children with you all the time, you may be also getting 2, 3 buses to view a place when, there's no hope of you actually getting that place. It's really kind of soul destroying for a lot of families. But also trying to get a foot back into employment or into training and that type of thing. So they really had to juggle a lot of care responsibilities and the lack of access to childcare, even with, the reforms that have come in around the National Childcare Scheme. The availability of places weren't there, and in particular full-time places. So it was definitely an issue. It was a particular issue for migrant families because they mightn't have that family support system, even on a temporary measure. Just so, can you look after the kids while I go try and do this? And they just didn't. Many of them didn't really have that. But also, a lot of the Irish-born families had, elderly relatives that they had to also those other care demands that was on them too. So, but it had a profound impact on their capacity to find housing, find training, or find education, or find employment. So it was huge. They talked about it a lot.
Yeah. And I think it really came across for me in one of the interviews, because in the report, one of the interviews had to be stopped because of the lone parent you were interviewing
Yeah.
didn't have childcare. The child was in another room in the accommodation that they live in, but still, that lone
Yeah.
parent had to stop the interview process because there was no childcare there.
So it was in an emergency accommodation, and me was a lone father, and we had a room that the room directly led into the kitchen area where there was a table and
Yeah.
there was lots of families milling around. The 2 children who were 10, 11 years old, and were just doing their homework on the table. But then the manager of the place saw that the children weren't supervised and came in and, as you say, stopped the interview. So, and like, of course, there's reasons behind that, that children have to be supervised at all times. It just, though, demonstrates the practical difficulties of parents unable to even engage in a research interview, let alone going out looking for a job or going out engaging in courses and that. It's huge.
Yeah, because when you think in, like, in anybody's home, I know in my home, I could be in the sitting room doing something, my children are in the kitchen doing their homework, and that would be normal. It's fine. But the restrictions on them are so tough that they have to stay, within the vicinity or watching their children at all times.
Most commonly, there'd be kind of shared kitchen facilities in emergency accommodation rather than, a unit that had kitchen facilities. That would be more rare. But anyway, in the shared kitchen facilities, they'd have to kind of bring their children with them downstairs to, cook and that type of thing. So yeah, even just cooking, they'd have to, cart them around everywhere, which is hard on the children too.
And did they speak about the trade-offs they'd have to make because of childcare? It's, because I'm thinking then it's childcare, then it's a trade-off between getting employment then and bring that financial stability along. It seems to be when you read the report, there's all those trade-offs that have to be made or decided upon.
Yeah, I think like it's interesting, the concept of trade-offs. And I'd say all lone parents have, and indeed all parents, but particularly lone parents, have this question in their minds at all times. But the lone parents I interviewed, the children were always their priority, and not just about being, the best possible parent that they could be, but also, as I mentioned before, pursuing better quality employment, including or pursuing training. And it was always with the view of providing for their children a better life, especially like a lot of lone parents would have felt enormous guilt, even though it wasn't necessarily a result of any individual failure on their part, but rather structural, issues that are there and systemic failures too, but they're really internalizing a lot of this blame themselves. So, there's enough that they really want to just try to get out of this situation, but really for the well-being of their children. So, but I think for them, like being a lone parent, it was one big trade-off. Was just, there was so many things that they are needing to address, whether it be housing or accessing childcare or accessing employment, education, that they were in this kind of vortex of problems. It was hard to access one without the other. It's hard to find a home when you don't have a job and you're dependent on social welfare. It's hard to find a job when you don't have a home. It's hard to engage in any type of training or education when you don't have a home. It's hard to engage in employment when, you don't have childcare to cover for your children, especially in a homeless situation. So they were really stuck, again, was the word. It kept coming up.
Yeah. And I guess it really does challenge the assumption that get a job and then everything will improve once you have a job. It just puts that in a whole new perspective, I think, doesn't it?
I think a lot of the times they would have felt, maybe in their interactions with certain services or certain staff in certain services, that there'd be a particular abrasive treatment or intrusive questioning that have subtle inferences that are suggesting that they're lazy, or they're suggesting that they're not trying hard enough for their. So, a lot of time lone parents internalize this sense of shame and stigma. That's, again, not a result of their individual failure, but just wider kind of social norms or family norms. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I think what's coming across is that, what we've discussed so far, it's not all about poor financial choices or decisions that have been made. It's just circumstances. Sometimes it's the housing crisis we have at this moment is just impacting so many, but lone parents seem to be those that are experiencing that significantly.
And yeah, because you can see even during COVID, when there was these emergency measures brought in, and So, for example, they introduced a moratorium on evictions, and they also ring-fenced a certain amount of social housing for for families that were in emergency accommodation. The point being, these emergency initiatives, you can see a direct decline of family homelessness. So these kind of policy decisions do have an impact on the homelessness rates of families. So you could see like a dip, and then before it increases again. And like the increases, it's just, it's since 2014, it's just on one trajectory. So there's serious problems in how we're responding to this and preventing it and resolving it.
So far, we've heard how fragile finances, limited childcare, and persistent stigma shape daily life for lone parent families in Ireland. We leave it there for this episode. Next time, we step back and look at what this tells us about the systems meant to support families, where they fall short, what needs to change, and how we move from crisis to solutions. So make sure you join us for the next episode.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Master My Balance. If you liked what you heard, then be sure to hit like and subscribe. And why not share with like-minded people? Until next time, you can follow us on all socials at Master My Balance. And we'll see you next time.